Welcome to everyone tuning in to join us for this special July edition of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation's First Friday series. My name is Bart Ziegler. I am the president of the Samuel Lawrence Foundation, and one of the issues of particular concern to us here at the Samuel Lawrence Foundation is the complex issue of nuclear waste. What to do with it, how to manage it for 100,000 years, and how to safely navigate the dangers it poses to us here in California and around the world. For today's very special edition of First Fridays, we have assembled a truly extraordinary panel of experts from the Golden State, from around the nation, and even from Europe to offer their formidable perspectives on the challenges posed by radioactive waste. At this point, I'll turn it over to our wonderful moderator, CEO of Brooklyn Story Lab, Lance Gould, to introduce our speakers. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Bart, and welcome to all. Nuclear power is seen by many as a clean solution to the climate crisis, a crisis that is posing an existential threat to the planet. But how can nuclear power truly be clean when deadly radioactive waste is the byproduct of that process? And when that dangerous waste is a threat to the communities where it is produced, the communities through which it travels for storage, the communities where it is eventually stored, and the rest of the planet, all of which are subject to fallout when the inevitable accidents, leaks, and mishaps take place. Recent federal policy and regulatory changes are expanding the nuclear industry and loosening regulation. This will exacerbate radioactive waste dangers, posing increasing threats to communities in California and to reactor communities nationwide. Later this month, the Samuel Lawrence Foundation will produce a day-long symposium at the University of California, San Diego on July 24th, at which expert presenters will discuss emerging solutions to this growing problem of the safe storage of nuclear waste. That includes an unprecedented new policy initiative in California to mandate the development of a state plan for the safer on-site storage of radioactive waste, which could also serve as a model for nuclear reactors across the country. In this episode of the First Fridays video podcast series, we'll present a primer on the symposium in two parts. First, we'll feature an array of experts who will weigh in on the current state of the 3.6 million pounds of deadly radioactive waste stored on the beach just 100 feet from the Pacific Ocean at the now shuttered San Onofre nuclear power plant in California. And then we'll bring in a second set of experts to look at the same issues, but from a global perspective. Along the way, we'll discuss the inherent dangers of storing and transporting nuclear waste, the track record of a corporate giant that has stewardship over many current and decommissioned nuclear power plants, and the future direction of national policy on deadly radioactive waste. So joining us today in our first cohort, we have, in alphabetical order, Stephanie Cook, an opinion writer for intelligence, for energy intelligence, who helped launch Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, of which she was its editor until 2022. She is also author of In Mortal Hands, A Cautionary History of the Nuclear Age. Dr. Richard Gersberg, a professor emeritus of environmental health in the School of Public Health at San Diego State University. He specializes in water quality research and limnology and has broad experience working with both chemical and microbiological pollutants and risk assessments. Gary Hedrick, co-founder of San Clemente Green, a local grassroots organization working to address safety problems at the San Onofre reactors and other environmental issues in the area. And Robert Richmond, who is director of the Kewalo Marine Laboratory at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He is also an expert on radioactive contamination of the oceans. Thank you all for joining us. As noted, for our first round of discussion, we'll speak with our panelists about San Onofre, the dangers posed by it, the options we have to move the radioactive waste, and what lessons we can take from the missteps of this disastrous program and apply them to reactors present and future in other locales. So, Gary, another nuclear disaster took place just across the Pacific 13 years ago when an earthquake and tsunami led to electrical grid failure at a nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan. You have had conversations with the survivors of that disaster. What did they warn you about? Gary, I'm sorry, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Immediately after the accident, there were desperate calls for technical assistance from the global community to respond to this unforeseen disaster. In fact, it had actually been predicted that an earthquake of 9.0 was possible and that it could negate all of the earthquake and tsunami.
Gary, I apologize.
At the same
We lost
time,
your audio. We lost your audio there for a second. So after 9.0, I think was the last thing we heard.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a connection problem too, so let's hope for the best. Um,
Absolutely.
9.0 earthquake was possible, and that could negate all of the earthquake and tsunami preparations the Japanese citizens had adopted, some of the best in the world. At the same time, there was a surge of compassionate unofficial ambassadors from Japan, including farmers, fishermen, teachers, and concerned mothers, not so much asking for assistance, but more to warn us that it could happen here too if we don't prepare now. Besides ignoring their own experts, the Japanese government withheld crucial information from the population. Teachers played down the contaminated food they were serving their students. Traditional farms and fishing fleets passed down through many generations had to be abandoned. Even doctors lost hospital privileges for correctly diagnosing disease attributed to radiation instead of finding another reason for their ailments. At San Onofre, a similar condition existed where management ignored engineers' warnings about starting newly installed steam generators without testing them first. 11 months after restarting, there was an accident, which eventually led to the permanent closure of songs. Only a few tubes were leaking, but the rest of the 10,000 tubes could have broken immediately in a rapidly cascading catastrophic event. Much of California would have been left uninhabitable if it weren't for the quick thinking of employees that had anticipated what to do and what to look out for. They prevented a widespread disaster.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. It's very sobering. You mentioned SONGS, and just for the audience to know, SONGS is an acronym for San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station. So that's the now shuttered nuclear power plant that is up for discussion here. Gary, what concrete steps would you like to see to correct the issues at San Onofre? And when I say issues, I mean there's 3.6 million pounds of radioactive waste buried there right now.
Yeah. Well, currently there's no plan for responding to radiation escaping from San Onofre for any reason, because it would be so unlikely, according to the industry, that would avoid that expense if at all possible. Although the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is ultimately in control, there is a movement in California to simply make a plan for them to approve. Basically, it would involve on-site construction of a well-protected facility that is far above the sea level, capable of storing nuclear waste, repairing and repackaging it into containers that are designed for long-term storage, unlike the thin-walled temporary canisters in use today. If we could get that done, we could possibly set the example for other 76 nuclear waste sites around the country to do the same before thin-walled temporary canisters begin to fail. Another concrete step that is lacking is to incentivize the next generation to study for the problem of nuclear waste before they inherit such a time-sensitive threat to their existence. We call it rolling stewardship, as one generation takes ownership from the previous one. With the California plan, radioactive waste would be safely stored above ground in a protective, robust shelter until there is a permanent solution. Even deep geologic repositories, like the one about to open in Finland, may not be the answer. It could actually worsen the situation by magnitudes if something goes wrong after it's buried. In the absence of having permanent nuclear waste solutions, it's foolish to continue to invest in solutions that make more of it, especially when it comes to creating highly concentrated waste from small modular reactors that are being heavily promoted by the industry. Perhaps it's only wishful thinking, but I'd like to believe that if given the opportunity to analyze the problem over time, a beneficial solution might be discovered by future generations. In my wildest dreams, I can imagine a day when someone discovers that you can convert radiation directly into electrical energy simply by exposing it to panels similar to solar panels without making any more waste. I'm certainly no expert, but it doesn't seem to be that far of a stretch of the imagination, considering that solar energy all began with Edmund Becquerel. He discovered the photovoltaic effect in 1839. A process that produces voltage or electric current when exposed to light or radiant energy. Can X-ray light be that much different than radiation from the sun? Edmund was the son of two physicists and was only 19 years old when he discovered solar energy while working in their lab. Coincidentally, Edmund had a son named Henry Becquerel, a name now associated with the measurement of radioactive energy. Henry's discovery of spontaneous radioactivity is another famous example of serendipity and how chance favors the prepared mind. In the span of only 56 years, Edmund and Henry Becquerel gave the world these two major scientific discoveries. So I wonder if that person will solve the problem in the nuclear waste problem. I wonder if that person who could solve this problem has even been born yet.
I certainly hope so, because that will be that'll be quite some time off. You mentioned small modular reactors, Gary, and we're certainly going to talk about those coming up later in the program. Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Bob Richmond now. Speaking of Fukushima, Bob, I want to turn to you. You're a scientist who's actually visited Fukushima post-accident as part of an international safety evaluation team. Bob, you've been on First Fridays before, and the last time you were on, we talked about your visit to Fukushima after the disaster there in 2011. You mentioned that on your visit to Fukushima, you witnessed what you described as poorly designed and performed science, posing as quote-unquote proof that the impact of the contaminated water would be minimal. Can you again relate what you witnessed there at Fukushima and give us context of how that might have impact on San Onofre and the rest of the world?
Sure. Thanks, Lance. So first and foremost, as a scientist, my job is to collect data, evaluate the data, and through opportunities like this and others in publication, is to share that information. So the biggest hope we all have is that good science will be used to inform decisions and to support good decision making. And
Bob,
so,
can I interrupt for 1 sec? Can somebody else mute that might be Bart, but can you or Paul? Can you mute everyone else just so we can just? I want to make sure that we hear everything Bob is saying. I apologize, Bob. If you can go again.
No problem. And so the idea there is that if decision makers don't have good data, they can't make good decisions. And this is the problem, one of the problems that I and the other panelists that are serving a group called the Pacific Islands Forum, we've been working together for about 2 years and reviewing the data and the information from Fukushima. And then as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. So 3 of us got to go to Fukushima. And it was very disturbing. I mean, honestly, I had sleepless nights after seeing the things I saw there. And I did my doctoral dissertation research at Enewetak Atoll, the home of the nuclear testing program. So there's not a whole lot that scares me, but this one really did. One of the experiments they were doing was to supposedly understand the uptake and accumulation of tritiated water, tritium, and other radionuclides in exposure to bottom fish. And it was the most poorly designed experiment I've ever seen. I have high school students in my laboratory doing science fair projects that immediately saw the flaws when I pointed out to them. The reality is that dilution is a chemical process. So they keep pushing the solution of pollution is dilution. And that's not true at all when you add biology. As soon as radionuclides get into a system where there are organisms, it can be taken up. It can be trophically transferred from one link in the food web to another, and it can be biomagnified. And this is exactly what we saw historically with things like mercury and tuna. It's the same deja vu all over again. This experiment is using bottom fish in a fiberglass tank being fed aquaculture pellets. And so 3 different occasions, I explained to them why they were so proud of it. We have video cameras on these fish in a fiberglass tank that are being fed aquaculture pellets. Isn't this great? And I pointed out to them, you could do the same experiment with a kitchen sponge. You put it in the water, it absorbs, it reaches equilibrium, what's in the water, you stick it in a clean tank of water, and it depurates. Why in the world are you even considering that this is a valid experiment? What do fish eat when they're in the environment? They don't eat aquaculture pellets. And I have to say, without an ad hominem attack, their response after 3 attempts to say, if you want to know what's going on with uptake, accumulation, and biomagnification, you put sediment in the tanks, you put worms and snails and crabs in the sediment. When those things take up the radionuclides and are fed on by the fish, then you can look at the way things like organically bound tritium could be found in the fish and other things. They said, no, 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 we don't need to do that. I offered to design the experiment, collect the data, and help them analyze it. So their response was to get a picture of the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Grossi, holding up a jar of aquaculture pellets over this fiberglass tank. And the quote is, the science is impeccable. And this is the concern we have, is what happened there was a tragedy. Our hearts go out to the people of Japan. As the previous speaker mentioned, the people in TEPCO knew ahead of time that they should expect at least a 15-meter, 45-foot tsunami wave should things occur the way they were predicted. Even the International Atomic Energy Agency warned them 4 years in advance it was going to occur. So here we have this disaster, and as was pointed out, all of their quote-unquote protections and redundancies were a total failure. So what we see is this group saying, don't worry about it now, trust us. They have what's called the Advanced Liquid Processing System that we also toured. And the data that we've been reviewing is all over the place. It's inconsistent. There are 62 radionuclides. They continue to focus on one. They talk about tritiated water because they can't remove it, but they also can't remove carbon-14. Tritium has a half-life of 12.6 years, carbon-14, 5,730 years. So when we talk about multi-generational issues, this is not only transboundary, but it is transgenerational. And it's not a matter of if things will go wrong, it's a matter of when things will go wrong. They're stating that even on this history, and there's a great article, if you look up just was Fukushima preventable, just Google that. You'll see some great articles to say absolutely, it was a failure of design, of safety, and the same exact people who were involved in the bad decisions there are now overseeing what's going forward. So yeah, there are things that terrify me there, and these are totally unnecessary. And the bottom line is that dumping in the ocean is simply irresponsible and unacceptable and unnecessary. We came up with another.
I'm gonna interrupt you there because I have another question about that specifically. Just for the audience, when you mentioned TEPCO, that's the Tokyo Electric Power Company, I believe.
That's correct.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that they have context to what you're talking about. What you're saying is so important, by the way. Not only was this very predictable, not only did we know that this was going to happen, but the post-fact science experiments that they did were not really science experiments at all. They had no scientific value whatsoever. When you surface that in your report, I'm going to come back to the other question in a second, but when you surface that in your report, how was that met?
With denial and with distraction and with just everything. Look over there. It was, squirrel. Oh yeah, here, squirrel. And so, we had some very animated discussions. The International Atomic Energy Agency has some incredibly good scientists, and they have access to the best in the world. And yet, when we started pointing out all of these flaws in the science, we're getting responses from people. Again, I don't want to attack anybody ad hominem. I think the IAEA is doing a great job in trying to prevent nuclear proliferation. They did a great job in Ukraine in trying to control what's going on in Chernobyl and not make things worse. But they are so conflicted. If you look on their website, the International Atomic Energy Agency has a mandate to promote the use of nuclear technologies. So you truly have the fox guarding the hen house. And when we pointed out, a number of the scientists shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah. And the head, who has a master's and a PhD, the master's is in history and the PhD is international relations, is the one claiming scientific integrity. And it just doesn't match whatsoever. Mistakes for me.
That's very discouraging, very disappointing, very scary. Well, not to cut you short, but I want to go back to this other question that I had.
Sure.
Bob, tell us about what happens when nuclear waste gets into the ocean, because the volume of water is so large. I think there are assumptions by non-scientists that it is okay to dump or release, as they say, radioactive water into the oceans. But from a scientific perspective, are there negative impacts to marine life, to marine ecosystems, and to human health?
Absolutely. And here's the issue, is we have a number of physicists and chemists that do the calculations, and their calculations are correct. If you take the volume of the ocean and the volume of radionuclides and you match them out, then you have this huge dilution. But that's not reality. As soon as radionuclides go into the water, especially tritium, which is hydrogen, and carbon-14, we're all carbon-based life forms. So the hydrogen and the carbon are immediately picked up by everything from phytoplankton, the very base of the ocean food web, and working their way up from the small phytoplankton to the zooplankton to the larval fish to the large fish. And, this is relevant for San Diego. The year Fukushima disaster occurred, tuna caught off of San Diego had cesium that could be tracked back to Fukushima. So there's the distribution of radionuclides in ocean currents. And once again, here's where the physics and the dilution fails terribly, is water doesn't mix evenly. It's not an even dilution. These water parcels remained intact based on things like salinity and temperature, and they move as parcels that are intact. And the same way fishermen know, fish are not uniformly distributed throughout the ocean. You go to where they're accumulated. The same thing is happening with productivity and where these plumes are going to end up. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The most recent models we've been looking at is about 7 to 12 years. This plume is going to be sitting right in the central area of the tuna fisheries for the Pacific. But to the biology, a beta emitter, which tritium is, and a lot of these are what they call low energy, but we look at a term called RBE, radiological biological effectiveness. It means that a beta emitter is a particle that can get embedded into tissue and continue to expose anything to ionizing radiation. One of the ones we're very concerned about, more so than even tritium, is strontium-90, which is nicknamed the bone seeker. The reason why it replaces calcium in bone, and your bones are where your blood cells are formed, your white blood cells and red blood cells. The last thing you want is ionizing radiation sources in the bone where cells are constantly turning over. That's where cancers come from. The radiation and the beta emitters can cause damage to DNA and to RNA. We have 2 types of DNA in the body without trying to get too nerdy. The nuclear DNA has the stuff that gives our information to future generations. That has a little bit of a protective membrane, but we also have a kind of DNA called mitochondrial DNA that basically runs the show. It tells the body what to do. It does your metabolism, immune system, everything about the operation of a human body or any animal body is run by the mitochondrial DNA. And ionizing radiation causes damage to the DNA, RNA, and a group of very important proteins called signaling proteins that tell the body what to do and when to do it. Anytime it gets ingested, there is no protection for these very critical cell portions. And this is our biggest concern. Beta emitters can be blocked by clothing or even skin to a certain extent. But once you ingest it through seafood, which will take up and has been proven to take up radionuclides, it's a whole different story. Once you ingest it, there's a huge problem.
This is emergency level information that you're sharing with us. Thank you, Bob. And later in the program, we're going to have someone in the second panel from the Radiation and Public Health Project who has which has studied the effect and impacts of radiation on people, and particularly strontium-90 on in an experiment they did on baby teeth. But thank you again for that, Bob. Rick, your specialty is risk assessment following disasters, particularly as relates to human health. What is your current assessment of the conditions at San Onofre, while noting that and for the audience to know this as well, and we're talking to Rick now, I'm sorry, there we go, while noting that 9 million people live in a 50-mile radius of the plant, where again, 3.6 million pounds of radioactive waste are stored on the beach in an earthquake zone.
Yes, and I think I'm in the 50-mile radius where I live, so it certainly worries me. And just to put it in perspective, one fuel assembly, and there's hundreds of those in the core of a reactor, and now thousands of them in the spent dry cask canisters at San Onofre. One fuel assembly itself is giving off a radiation field, again, I don't want to get nerdy, of 10,000 rems per hour. And 500 rems is the lethal dose for a person. So quick calculation means if a person stands near an unshielded fuel assembly coming out of the core of a reactor for 3 minutes or a few minutes, they will eventually get radiation sickness and die. And there's thousands of those fuel assemblies, again, each one giving off that field, that deadly field, in each dry cask, or in each dry cask and at San Onofre. So the radiation field is tremendous. There is shielding, I will say, and of course the public is not allowed near that, but there's a tremendous amount of radioactivity. If we talk about how much radioactivity are in those dry casks at San Onofre, if we just pick one of the most hazardous radioisotopes that has a 30-year half-life, so stays around, the half-life is the amount of time it takes to decay to half its initial mass, then that's cesium 137, and we'll just pick that one. There's over 100 million curies of cesium 137, and again, I'll put that into perspective,
Sure.
in the San Onofre dry casks. Now,
In
if we
in
think
in,
of,
in each cask or collectively?
no, and collectively,
Okay.
quite a bit over 100 million curies, just of cesium 137. And again, to put that in perspective, I think at Chernobyl, a few million.
Rick, I'm sorry to interrupt. I think Gary, if you can go on mute because I think we're getting some feedback from you.
Oh, that's
Please go ahead, Rick.
at Chernobyl and at Fukushima, only a few million curies. Well, only still a tremendous amount, but a few million curies, 2 or 3 million curies of this hazardous radioisotope cesium 137 were emitted after the accident. And again, there's 50 times that at the San Onofre in the dry cask. So there's just a tremendous amount of radioactivity. Now, uh, it's better in dry casks than in the past when it was in pools, in fuel pools. I think everyone agrees that those were more dangerous. And that's the reason they moved it to dry casks. But San Onofre is unique. And again, when I tell this to friends, again, who live in the San Diego and San Clemente area, they're shocked that it's 100 feet from the beach. The seawall is whatever 14 feet high, but isn't going to. It's going to be overtopped in a tsunami. So you have tsunami hazards. You have climate change and rising sea levels. Uh, the groundwater is within a foot and a half of the bottom of those dry casks. It's in an earthquake fault zone. From what I've read, a 7.4 earthquake could be predicted, and those casks were, from what again read from NRC, were only designed for a 7 earthquake. Not to mention what can happen from a terrorist attack. So there's
And
all.
if I might add, I
Sure.
believe those canisters were designed to last 40 years, and they're coming up past that due date. And
That's true.
also, king tides are already approaching San Diego, and so we're already seeing some of the impacts of climate change in that area. So just to add
No, that's
to your
perfect.
fear.
No, that's true. So there's a lot of, I mean, it's a rather, I mean, the casks seem to be intact. The NRC says that, but it's really a very frail system with all those impacts that are possible. Um, so if, in the worst case, if all of that radioactivity was given off by somehow, there isn't much information. I know Sandia and others have looked at plane crashing into that dry storage, and it's really hard to get information of what they found. They say it would resist, but if a lot of that radioactivity was given off, it would be a catastrophe to those 8.5, 9 million people. We've never seen anything like that before. But even the NRC says the casks can have smaller leaks and accidents. And even in that case, and I read a report that said about 35, in what they call a leak or a release scenario, 35,000 curies of activity could be given off in the best case kind of release, not in the whole mass release. And you know, I don't know how familiar the audience is with dirty bombs when they use a, let's say, cancer therapy machine and then put just dynamite This is not a nuclear explosion. This is just an explosion giving off a radiological device, which it's called the radiological dispersion device. In that case, we're only talking about 500 to 1,000 curies. And that could basically cause evacuation and basically make square blocks to, in some cases, square miles inhabitable. That is, people cannot move back. So the NRC's lower limit of release from these dry casks at 35,000 could be 35 times worse, in which
Oh my.
case that would cause mass panic, mass evacuation, inhabitable areas around San Onofre, not to mention an increase in cancer risk and loss of economic activity, and of course the recreational value of our great ocean in Southern California. So it's just a bad place to have that much waste.
It's a
And
perfect storm, really, based on what
yes,
on all these factors. Rick, just last summer, as we noted with Bob a few minutes ago, officials at Fukushima released hundreds of thousands of gallons of contaminated wastewater into the Pacific, more than a decade after that disaster took place. Um, Bob already gave us some of his scientific perspectives on that. But as another of your specialties is wastewater-based epidemiology, can you give us your perspective on what dangers does the radioactive waste at San Onofre pose to our water systems, particularly in California, where water is not always so plentiful?
well, yes, I will echo Bob somewhat there. I agree with him 100%. Um, I have looked not at radiological outfalls, but I've worked quite a few at sewage outfalls. And Bob said the solution to pollution should not be dilution. But when I looked at the San Onofre situation, and then I looked at what's happening at Indian Point and at Cape Cod Bay at Pilgrim Reactor, where
And
both
Indian Point, just for the audience, is 36 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River.
correct, and the Pilgrim Reactor is on Cape Cod Bay. In both cases, Holtec would like to release uh, water, radiologically contaminated water, into those bodies of water,
And
and they
Holtec is the corporate entity that is that we'll discuss later that is overseeing some of these decommissioned plants. Just
correct,
for the audience to know. Sorry.
no, yes. And in both cases, they've been stopped by state action and it's going to court. But San Onofre has been in the past and will be again releasing radiologically contaminated water into the ocean. And they dilute it first by 1,000 times or so. And then, of course, they meet the standards by dilution. But as Bob said very well, um, dilution just dilutes it out, but the mass that it's really the mass, how much are you putting in and what happens to it. And as again Bob said, it's mostly tritium, radioactive tritium that they're putting out, and that can be taken up uh, by plants and animals in the ocean. And of course cesium-137 and strontium-90, two other isotopes, can also be taken up, and very readily. So I looked at the monitoring data and their scheme, because I've worked on outfalls, and I was less than impressed. I looked at their level of detection for, this was Southern California, Edison and San Onofre, for tritium and for cesium-137, those two. And lo and behold, I found that their methods that they were using were 100 to 1,000 times less sensitive than some of the scientists and the technical people at other places, particularly Fukushima. So they're not using, from what I've seen, they're not using the most sensitive methods to detect tritium and cesium in the ocean water. And if you don't use a sensitive method, if you don't look, you don't find, so to speak. And then their conclusion is that when they look at samples right near the outfall where they're putting out this liquid effluent, radiologically contaminated effluent, and then they have control sites 5 miles away or 10 miles away, they say they're not different. Well, they could be not, maybe they're not different, but maybe they're not different because they're not using the most sensitive methods to look for tritium and to look for cesium-137. So I was, in a way, shocked. And
I want to move on to the next guest, just conscious of time, but I want to ask one last question before I go. When you observed this, were you able to relay that to anyone conducting this work, or has your voice fallen on deaf ears?
I did not relay it to anyone at SCE, Southern California. I relayed it to Bart, and perhaps Bart has contacts to relay it to others, but no, the answer is no.
All right. Well, hopefully this. Thank you, Rick.
I just have one follow-up.
Oh,
They
sure,
also,
sure.
and Bob Richmond mentioned this, they also have no idea where that plume goes. They just have static monitoring stations. From what I've seen, they've never really looked to try to follow the plume of where that radiologically contaminated liquid effluent after dilution is going out. So they don't really know whether it's different, and they don't know where it's going. So they really know very little.
I want to remind the audience that the people we're speaking to today are scientists, experts, people who've studied this material so closely. This is not crackpot science. This is really this is so frightening and so important for us. So I'm hoping that people watching this, whether now or later, Rick, will be able to take the information you're sharing with us and bring it to the highest level. I'm going to move on to Stephanie now, a very well-respected journalist who's covered this industry for so long. Stephanie, in a recent op-ed that you wrote for the New York Times, you noted how world leaders are fixated on nuclear and look to expand nuclear power into the future. And as all of that is transpiring, as you note, even though it is more costly, it takes longer to deliver and it's riskier. Meanwhile, wind and solar are demonstrating remarkable gains in energy market share, and nuclear is steadily declining. What do you make of this paradoxical interest in nuclear energy that is not as effective, it costs more, and it doesn't even have the market?
First of all, this is nothing new, Lance. It's sort of artificially created interest led by the United States government and echoed by other nuclear countries around the world. For instance, Japan, France, England, etc. Germany being the exception now. The United States government has been promoting nuclear energy as a sort of antidote, the other side to nuclear weapons, the so-called better side. And there have been iterations of these kind of promotional efforts ever since. The current effort arguably began after Fukushima and is sort of a reboot of an effort that started under George Bush, the second George Bush. And that effort also included a global effort. They wanted to do reprocessing like they are now, all of these very dangerous, expensive, waste-creating processes that are being advertised as environmentally sound because they supposedly reduce nuclear waste. This is a false claim, but false claims are nothing new to the nuclear industry or to the governments that promote it. Today's efforts are riding on a wave of popularity not seen since the Atoms for Peace effort in the 1950s. And these efforts are characterized by ridiculous promises of how many reactors they're going to build by such and such a date. They are also characterized by the creation of high growth energy scenarios that usually don't pan out and may not even this time, even with all the hype about artificial intelligence and electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And they and if the timing is right, they are attached to a bandwagon like the anti-coal bandwagon in the 70s, and now it's in the early aughts, it was against fossil fuels. It's still against fossil fuels, but it's broadly been put under a banner of a solution to climate change. This to me is a travesty, especially having heard what our first two august and very, very knowledgeable speakers said about the waste and the pollution of the oceans. It's these scientists are not naive junior high school scientists. They are handpicked by governments to create reports which put a gloss on things like the release of the treated water from Fukushima, which, by the way, is going on by the Japanese government's own words for at least 3 decades. I didn't realize. I knew there were other contaminants in the water. I'd like to hear more, but somehow this current promotional effort of nuclear energy now includes some very well-known or not so well-known environmental groups. Even the MacArthur Foundation has pretty much given up funding for like nonproliferation efforts and things like that. I believe, I can't be certain, but that's what I understand from people that were former recipients of that kind of funding. And these people, it has become fashionable among some of these environmental groups previously opposed to nuclear energy to now support it. This is
And they're just to add context, they're doing so to, and we're going to address this later in the program as well. But I'd love for you to continue to address it here. They're doing so under the rubric of it's a clean alternative to fossil fuels.
correct, and it's not clean. It is so unclean, as we've heard. This is an energy source that is probably the cause of could be a contributing cause to the increase in cancers among younger people, which is very disturbing. And the thing that isn't getting across, because somehow the messaging isn't getting across to the general public, is the environmental harm that nuclear energy does. It needs to be said in very simple terms with graphic images, that so people understand that just because it's supposedly carbon free or low carbon energy source, it's not a zero carbon. It has other consequences which could be far worse. And so I think that that's a real a challenge for the other side, and one that needs to be taken up and really driven home, because people are, first of all, they have just completely, they don't know, nobody addresses waste anymore. Everybody just says, oh, that'll just go away, like they did in the 50s. You know, Oppenheimer said it's not a problem. It is a problem. And there isn't going to be a permanent fix. I just don't believe in that. It's going to be a thing in even the Finns who have supposedly come up with a solution. The woman that runs the Finnish waste program told me that it's a work in progress, and they're going to be monitoring it all the time. Who can predict what's going to happen 100,000 years out? I'm sorry, that's just ridiculous. But I'll stop there because I think I've already taken too much time on this first question.
No worries at all. Thank you. It's everything you're saying is so important and so valuable to the audience. Just to revisit this with another lens, are there financial factors at play here? In another piece that you wrote for Fortune, you noted that despite claims to the contrary, we are not in a new nuclear golden age. But this trend is, and you alluded to this in your first answer. But this trend is being driven by players in the nuclear industry.
It's being driven by people in the nuclear industry and by these environmental groups, and also by the Department of Energy and all the various atomic energy crowds in various countries. So I said at the time I wrote the Fortune piece, which was about a year ago now, that it was, that since the beginning of this century or millennium, we have in the United States spent about more than 50 billion on this effort to bring more nuclear energy to the table. And what's resulted from that is exactly 2 reactors in Georgia and the completion of the Watts Bar 2 reactor in Tennessee. So that is a little under 4 gigawatts of power, which is pretty much nothing. And by the way, that first promotional effort that I mentioned that Bush started in the early 2000s, that there was talk of about 30 new reactors. Out of that came just 2. Now, there is a lot of dirty money sloshing about. That's why we have seen nuclear bribery scandals in Ohio and Illinois resulting in prison sentences for very high up people, including a woman who was possibly in line to become the head of Constellation. And also in South Carolina, where the summer nuclear project failed. This came out of the Bush effort. It collapsed under the weight of the Westinghouse bankruptcy, which was probably Westinghouse's like third bankruptcy in its history, its long and storied history. You have so you have a lot of money sloshing about without a lot of results. And the thing that I think is very, very seriously wrong about this for a planet that needs answers to climate change, a country that needs answers to climate change, is it's crowding out other options. That 50 billion ought to be being spent on worthwhile efforts to get our delivery, our transmission systems up and running and more capable of delivering wind and solar from where it's not needed to where it is needed. We need to work on the demand side of things, of the equation. There are so many other ways this money could have been more usefully spent.
Safer ways too.
Safer ways too. Unfortunately, some of this is related to a perceived need to have a civilian sector in nuclear to keep alive and to keep the weapons side more viable. That's something that Obama's Energy Secretary, Ernest Moniz, has pushed very heavily. But that's another discussion, but it's important for people to realize that is an element to this whole promotional effort.
And just to clarify that, meaning that the military-industrial complex wants the nuclear energy around in more ways so that it can maintain its.
I don't actually think the people that do weapons think they need it. That's what I've heard. If you talk to people frankly, they'll say that. But there's this perception that you need to have the talent. That's how you
I see, right.
You keep people feeding from the civilian side into the military. That's what the government wants to be able to do. And they want to make the industrial base stronger for nuclear, which is kind of a lost cause in my opinion. But I mean, they have the things they need for the military side. And I don't think the military side actually thinks. They kind of look down their noses at the civilian side, but it's pushed in that way.
Got it. I apologize because we're running a little long on time, and I want to make sure we stick to the stick to the schedule as best we can. But this is a group question for the first panel, and then we'll move to the second panel. From a regulatory perspective, there's great confusion looking at the issue of nuclear as a national problem as opposed to a local one. But we are lacking a comprehensive national strategy for handling radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel. And we have radioactive waste scattered at 75 different sites across the country. So at San Onofre, for example, when the local community is trying to figure out a way to handle it, there really isn't a way to do so because there isn't a national strategy, and you can't move it across state lines without permission, and there's no place to really put it. So, and I know this is going to be hard, but the question is, what can we do better? And what steps do we need to take to protect the 9 million citizens living within 50 miles of the 3.6 million gallons of deadly waste at San Onofre? But I want to limit everybody to just one sentence if possible. Let's start with Bob.
All right. Well, we ran into this with Fukushima in saying it's one thing to say no. It's another thing to come up with an alternative. For the case of Fukushima, and I'm not sure about California, but we looked at the concrete option that they're talking about releasing this water over at least 30 years. We're actually looking at more realistically 40 years. If they were to use that water to make concrete to be used on site, to build the seawall to the size it should be able to put the bags and bags of radioactively contaminated soil into bunkers so they don't get washed into the ocean on the first typhoon, and to be able to replace the ice barrier underground with concrete because ice is not going to work. And so no one's going to be living in Fukushima, period. For that particular area, putting it into concrete makes it non-biologically available. Beta emitters in concrete can't penetrate less than 5/100ths of a millimeter. And if you look at things like tritium with a half-life of 12.3 years, as was pointed out, concrete has a notable life of about 50 years functionality. You've gone through 4 half-lives and you're down to 6% of the ionizing radiation. If you're putting it in areas where there are not a lot of people around and other organisms, you can basically move it into it. And the good news is, concrete is bad for the environment in terms of CO2 production. but the new ways of building concrete formulations are actually able to sequester CO2. And this would be a double benefit of all things to help Japan get to the goals of the Kyoto Protocol. If they were to use it to mix concrete using the new methods to be able to sequester CO2 and keep it on site in the areas where they definitely need to use concrete, they would use it up in 7 to 10 years versus 30 to 40 years of discharge into the ocean. You'll never get the genie back in the bottle. Once that radionuclides are in the environment and they're picked up by fish, there's no way of ever getting it back.
Right, exactly. Okay, Stephanie, a quick thought here.
I
What we can do better.
I guess what I come from a non-scientific background, and I'm a journalist. I'm very aware of what the public thinks, of what people in Congress are saying, et cetera, et cetera. My feeling, I'd like to see that information that Bob just spoke about more widely publicized. I mean, graphically, about fish you are eating. You thought it was bad enough with a mercury problem. Well, guess what? And then you talk about Pilgrim. You also, by the way, throw in Seabrook. Seabrook's got another problem of concrete degradation there. And it's probably, I mean, I would assume radioactivity is going to escape that plant. And I would also, I would just like to see more effort taken about all of these reactors together facing this waste problem without a national solution. The fact is, there's not going to be a permanent underground repository anytime soon, if ever. And that people need to know that. People need to be aware that we are facing the consequences of 50 years of nuclear energy or 70 years right now. And why are we talking about compounding the problem, supposedly in the name of climate change, with rising sea levels in particular? I mean, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's what I'd say. I'm afraid I'm not qualified to come up with a scientific solution, though.
No, but your voice is welcome and important. So thank you, Rick.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Stephanie just said, that people need to know that. I mean, I'm from San Diego, and most people see the reactor containment buildings when they drive. Those are still there. And that's all they know really about it. And Gary at the outset basically said there's no robust emergency response plan. So
Yeah.
I would like, one, the community to know what's there and understand it, and two, for the response plan by the counties or by Edison or whoever to be made public. And because I know, I've looked at dirty bomb scenarios, and this could be much worse. The response is very important, or else you get panic. I mean, it's a disaster no matter what happens, but you don't want to compound that with panic. So,
absolutely. Thank you, Rick.
Okay.
And Gary, you gave some solutions earlier. You want to just give us a quick one, and then Paul Shockley, we're going to go right to the second panel after this.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. I just want to reiterate the importance of rolling stewardship and incentivizing students now for the future problems, because time is not on our side, and we need to move as quickly as possible with a way to create the ability to repair or replace a canister that's damaged. We don't have that yet. We need what they call a hot cell or a dry transfer facility. And we need a storage facility that will protect from terrorism and, weather events. Anything that would make us safer here is not welcomed by the industry, but it's the smart thing to do, and we need to be prepared. And like others have said, let's get the word out.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you, panel. We're going to switch to the second panel now. I'm going to ask the first panel just to stick around so that we are, so that when we conclude, we can all be on together. But we're going to switch to our second panel now, which is going to look beyond California. For this cohort, we have in alphabetical order, Kate Brown, a professor in the history of science at MIT, whose focus is on large-scale disasters and modernist wastelands. One of the many books she authored is Manual for Survival, or Chernobyl Guide to the Future. Dr. Paul Dorfman, who is a visiting fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex. He's also the chair of the Nuclear Consulting Group and a member of the Irish Government Environment Protection Agency's Radiation Protection Advisory Committee. Susan Hito Shapiro is a board member of the Radiation Public Health Project and is an environmental attorney in Hudson Valley, New York, where she's been actively involved in monitoring the decommissioned Indian Point nuclear power plant, which came up for discussion earlier. And Leona Morgan is an indigenous organizer who's been fighting nuclear colonialism since 2007. She's a co-founder of Hall No, an initiative to shut down a uranium mine near the Grand Canyon and related transport between the mine and the uranium mill. She is based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For the second round of discussions, we'll speak with our panelists about some of the global issues and challenges posed by nuclear energy, the unequal nature of how disadvantaged communities often bear the brunt of receiving toxic nuclear waste, how radioactive waste impacts not just our land, but our rivers and oceans, and the overall global landscape of the effort to rely on nuclear energy as an alternative to fossil fuels, something that Stephanie was talking about in the previous panel. So we're going to start off with Leona. Welcome, Leona. Consolidated Interim Storage, CIS, is a sanitized way to articulate a national warehousing system of radioactive waste in which most of the waste would end up elsewhere. Current targets for the CIS storage are in New Mexico and in Texas, New Mexico, of course, being where you are. Leona, you've noted in your work as a community organizer that CIS is nuclear colonialism. Tell us about how CIS is being fought in New Mexico and Texas, and how deadly toxic materials like spent nuclear fuel often ends up in structurally disadvantaged communities, including indigenous lands like the ones you represent in New Mexico.
Thanks, Lance, and thank you for this invitation to be here. Thank you to all my fellow panelists. Yeah, I think there's just one simple answer to your question. I can sum it all up to white supremacy, which is basically the whole the basis of our structure in the United States and most of the Western world. And so, because of the doctrine of discovery and the systems of institutionalized racism, we're often dealing with people of color, marginalized communities, always dealing with the brunt of the problem. And we refer to this as environmental justice. Of course, with indigenous peoples, we're dealing with a lot more going back to colonization. So when you're saying they're, targeting New Mexico and Texas, this is a fight we've been dealing with in two capacities. Statewide, you asked about the fight. Essentially, for folks, just to reiterate, consolidated interim storage. It's this idea to store high-level radioactive waste from power plants temporarily. And so this is not disposal, both of which are basically types of storage. So one would be temporary or more permanent. The CIS we were facing in New Mexico we were told it would be, about 100 years. I think all of the numbers escape me now. I think it was 120 years because their permit was 40 years that could be renewed twice. And that means, a lot longer than most of us or all of us will be alive. And so how can we hold our governments accountable to say they're going to take the waste when they say it's only going to be here temporarily? So the state of New Mexico fought it, and the state of Texas also fought it. So we had not only us as activists on the ground working together locally, regionally, and then statewide. In New Mexico, we also had a lot of participation by the All Pueblo Council of Governors. They took a very strong stance against Holtec. We talked about Holtec earlier. So Holtec was one of the companies that received a license for CIS, as well as waste control specialists who was working with Orano in France. So both of these companies applied for licenses that they both received to store the waste temporarily, and both of them were fought by the states. So right now we're still in waiting for whatever legal repercussions. I'm happy to say we are stopping them in New Mexico. We are stopping Holtec because we are not going to accept that waste. We already have the waste isolation pilot plant, which is a waste. The only geological deep repository for waste in the world, and that's for weapons waste, which is always, trying to expand, by size, by types of waste, also by the time that it's supposed to be open. WIP was supposed to close this year, but they want to extend it and just have it open forever. So what we're dealing with are two different problems of waste from both nuclear weapons and nuclear energy production that have no solution. And my people, indigenous people worldwide, we're dealing with the waste of abandoned uranium mines. I don't know if it's possible to share my screen just real quickly. I have some images. Is that okay, Lance?
I'm going to ask Paul if that's okay on the tech side. Sorry about that. We can't do that in this format. I'm going to stop you there for a second because my next question is about uranium mines, but I just want to ask a rhetorical question for people watching who think that nuclear energy is clean. New Mexico doesn't want it. Texas doesn't want it. What state or what entity would want it? Let's just think about that. Who would actually accept nuclear waste? And if that's the case, why would anyone think that that's a clean solution? But having said that, I'm going to go into the second question for you, Leona, which is precisely about uranium mines. And thank you for bringing that up. And also thank you for all the great work that you're doing on the ground in New Mexico. But let's talk about the dangers of uranium mining, Leona. Most of the uranium deposits in the U.S. are in the Four Corner states, which is Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and in Wyoming and Texas. That mining is hazardous not just for the workers, and let me point out many of whom have historically been indigenous people, but also for all the people in the surrounding area because of the impact of the mining. Can you tell us more about the dangers that mining has on the environment, including the air and water?
Sure. In a nutshell, I guess, people can talk about these things for days. This is not a subject that is to be taken lightly. When indigenous peoples are impacted, it triggers a lot of historical trauma going back to colonization, because uranium mining is another form of genocide. It's a very slow, invisible type of genocide, but nonetheless, this is what our U.S. government has been funding and promoting, since the Manhattan Project. And so, uranium mining today, we're looking at over 23. There's a map from Stanford. There's numbers that can be disputed. The EPA was saying 15,000 abandoned uranium mines nationally, but most recently, I saw a map that shows 23,000 abandoned uranium mines across the country. And when I say abandoned, this means the mines that were allowed to pollute and do whatever they wanted to, essentially, before there were environmental policies in place to protect, the water, the air, essentially human beings. But as indigenous peoples, a lot of the mining takes places on sacred lands. And so in South Dakota, we're talking about the Black Hills. In New Mexico, we have Mount Taylor. And then, of course, there's the Grand Canyon. So I am working with a group. We have been fighting a mine at the Grand Canyon, known as Canyon Mine, now called Pinon Plain. And this is a mine that just started this year. On January 8th, Energy Fuels started extracting uranium within a newly formed national monument. So Biden made this national monument to protect the Grand Canyon from new mining, but it only stopped claims that were created through the 1872 mining law. So this goes back to the colonization and theft of our lands. But there was a huge loophole that it stopped thousands of claims, sure, but it allowed mines that were already existing to move forward. So how does this national monument work if it's supposed to protect us from new mining, when only 3 months later Biden is pushing for tripling nuclear development worldwide as a non-solution to climate change? And so what we're dealing with, I'm really fearful to say it, because we don't want to speak these words to kind of manifest it, but essentially, with the price of uranium hovering where it's at, and then this, the United States no longer purchasing uranium from Russia, if people keep thinking that the United States is only using uranium for energy, they have to wake up. This is really about nuclear weapons. We have to look at the bigger picture. So it doesn't matter if it's so-called peacetime use of nuclear or military use. Either way, we are at the front end, and we're still dealing with abandoned uranium mines, and the United States just let the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act die. So if anyone knows about RECA, that is one of the few laws that acknowledges all the sickness and death that has been perpetrated by the United States. Again, going back to the Manhattan Project, they can say, oh, yeah, well, after 1971, it was private industry and energy companies. It is still the United States government, because they are the entity that will not sign UN treaties such as the new one that makes nuclear weapons illegal. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, says since January 2022 that 2022 that nuclear weapons are illegal internationally. And so this industry and the states behind it continue to perpetrate whatever they want in the name of freedom or security, when it's doing the exact opposite to us. It's taking our freedom, it's taking our security, and furthermore, it's killing us. And so these things, the effects to our people, that's one thing, our environment, our waters, but also what we call our non-human relatives. So our sacred places, the entities that are at these sacred places, all of our cultural resources, and what we call, again, our non-human relatives out there. Those impacts are immeasurable and irreversible. So that also is a cultural genocide. That is something beyond, what, when we're talking about cancers and alpha particles and the maximum contamination level in our water, which is way too high. 30 parts per billion is way too high to allow in our drinking water sources.
Well, as they say, every little bit helps. This is every little bit hurts. This is a compendium, the added value of all the things that you're mentioning, whether it's uh, the labor force, the history of mistreatment of your people and others, of the environment, of non-human relatives and cultural elements. All of it together is each aspect of it is terrible, but all collectively it's unimaginable. So thank you for sharing all of this. We'll come back to you at the end of this panel for the group discussion. Kate, you've written extensively about. Going to Kate now? Sorry, and we'll just wait for Kate to come on screen. Yeah, there. Oh no, there's Leona. Let's come back to Kate. There we go.
Right.
Kate, you've written extensively about other nuclear disasters such as Chernobyl. What similarities do you see between Chernobyl and San Onofre that give you concern? This is something you wrote, part of an op-ed that you wrote in the LA Times.
Well, I mean, there should be none, right? Chernobyl was an operating reactor that exploded. San Onofre is mothballed. Chernobyl existed in a country that had an authoritarian government that was notorious about hiding information and misinforming the public. San Onofre exists in a thriving democracy. So we should ask, like, what's there to worry about? Like, maybe there's nothing to worry about. But, we heard in the last panel about the volume of waste stored at San Onofre. And we heard about assurances that the mothball reactor is safe. But we also heard that there's no real plan. If there is a nuclear accident or a tsunami hitting, there's no real evacuation plan or emergency plan. And San Onofre and Chernobyl share those particular features in common. And I think the thing that I realized working on this Chernobyl project is that that same problem we have with nuclear accidents, we have with nuclear waste, which is they both have very long shelf lives. Nuclear accidents don't end. And we see that in the Chernobyl case in 2017 and again 2019. Hotter, drier summers in Ukraine, there were forest fires that reached the red forest. That's the most radioactive part of the Chernobyl zone. The radioactivity was stored in the leaf litter and in the biomass of the forest. When it lit on fire, that radioactivity was volatilized. It went airborne, and radioactive smoke from those Chernobyl fires went as far as the Netherlands. I mean, this was like a new nuclear accident spawned from Chernobyl, but it doesn't, it doesn't really resonate in the press. It doesn't really reach the public that Chernobyl continues. We saw in 2021 when the Russian army attacked Ukraine, one of the major portals that they brought their army through was the Chernobyl zone because it was an unprotected border with Belarus. As those tanks went in, churning up a lot of dust, the nuclear monitors at the site that you could see online went from green to red because they were kicking up a lot of radioactive dust. And then a day later, those nuclear monitors were killed, and we had no information about what was happening. But we learned later that the Russian soldiers dug into that red forest, the most contaminated place in the site, and lived in trenches there for several months until soldiers started to get sick, and then they pulled out. And so you might wonder, why didn't those Russian generals know that that was a terrible place to camp out with their soldiers? And I think that's one of the lessons we have, is that radiation lives for so long, it sort of breaches human attention spans. The other thing we learned, and I think this really could address San Onofre, is that we learned with this war in Ukraine about another kind of nuclear warfare that uses civilian nuclear sites as military zones. So after taking over the Chernobyl zone, the Russian army made a beeline to the Zaporizhia plant, which is an active nuclear power plant in central Ukraine, and they took it over. And once they did that, they started stockpiling weapons and putting a lot of soldiers there, knowing that the Ukrainians could not fire on them safely without causing a huge problem. The dam that held water that could have breached was blown up. All of this, the sources of electricity were to the plant were blown up. But even after they turned off the Zaporizhia plant, that plant still needs, as San Onofre does, electricity to cool the basins, to keep things going. We learned during the middle of that war that the International Atomic Energy Agencies and pretty much all the regulatory nuclear agencies in the world have stress tested reactors and the facilities around them for direct hit by a plane, for earthquakes, tsunamis, other things, but not for something as quotidian as a hit from a missile. They forgot to think about something so banal and so very human as war in the case of planning for nuclear emergencies. So these are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. We have a lot of existing reactors in this country and mothballed ones. Often they're on, like San Onofre, they're on sources of water. And we have an increasingly precarious weather and increasingly precarious situation with war and threats of war.
Just my mind is racing thinking about modern warfare and the definition of modern warfare does not even include the utilization or even and the unaware element of one party in war camping out in trenches in this contaminated forest, and but also utilizing a current nuclear power plant as a zone, knowing that it couldn't be attacked. It's so frightening.
And as a potential huge dirty bomb.
And then the forest fires going, taking toxic waste to the Netherlands just in terms of natural organic processes such as a fire. It's very frightening. Let's talk about health implications for a second, Kate. What are the concerns for citizens in the area? And we're talking about the San Diego area. 9 million people in a 50-mile radius as it relates to exposure to radioactivity. I know that's a discussion that has already taken place in this with some of the other guests, but what is your weigh in on that?
Well, let's take a look at the Chernobyl case. I went to Chernobyl. I speak Russian, and I went to Kiev to look at the health records because I thought, we don't really know much about what happened environmentally and medically after the Chernobyl accident. The UN said, it says between 30 and 54 people died, and there was a a chance of cancers of between 2 and 4,000 extra cancers. And I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine, and I met a lot of people, and I met way more than 54 people who claimed that their relatives had died from a Chernobyl-related illness. So I went to the archives, and the archivist said, you're not going to find anything. There's not going to be records on Chernobyl health effects. But I said, well, let's just look, and within a few minutes, we found huge bound volumes. With saying in simple Ukrainian, the medical consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. And I kept looking at, my assistants and I went to 27 different archives, got down to the county hospital records. And what we found, was in this Klondike of medical records and medical studies that were going on in the Soviet Union, unbeknownst to pretty much everybody, is that they were almost immediately experiencing a public health disaster. The Soviets said officially that 300 people were hospitalized from the accident. These were mostly firemen and nuclear operators. What our count was is that 44,000 people were hospitalized in the summer after the accident. 11,000 of them were children from Chernobyl exposures. The Soviets said, we tested, we looked at the thyroids and the blood of several 100,000 people. I think they 900,000 people, and we found no change in health statistics. The records show, just mounting health problems, starting with, pernicious anemia, digestive tract disorders, problems with respiratory conditions, cardiac among adults, cardiac conditions, thyroid, swollen thyroids, and then thyroid.
Kate, just to interject for 1 second, a question. Are you saying that, not that anyone would trust the Soviet government, but are you saying that the records that they kept showed otherwise, or
yes,
you're saying
exactly?
Okay.
It's all in the records. They do. The socialist government had so one huge hospital.
What they said publicly and what they said publicly and what they recorded written down were not. We're at odds.
Not at all.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So by 1990, the leaders of Belarus and then Ukraine are going to the UN and saying, we have a public health disaster and we need help. We cannot handle this on our own. At that time, by 1991, the Soviet Union fell apart, and there was no longer a government or any kind of political will or any money to deal with this disaster. And that's when the International Atomic Energy Agency stepped in and took over assessing the disaster. And I went to 5 UN agencies' archives. And what I find is that the International Atomic Energy Agency muscled out the World Health Organization, which was saying, we'll make pronouncements about the disaster because we're the health people. And international, the IEA was saying, no, we're the nuclear people, we'll do it. They were more powerful, they had more money, they took over. They sent in for one summer to do a pilot study, sort of cycling in, parachuting scientists who would take a look at things, leave, new scientists would come in over and over. And at the end of that summer, they said, we found a lot of illness. We found a rise in illness since the accident, a pretty steep, precipitous rise. But looking at our Hiroshima data from the atomic bomb survivor studies, and extrapolating, we see that we our contention is that none of these illnesses have anything to do with radiation and everything to do with stress. And that's pretty much where we stand today, unless you take these Soviet studies that were done by the Soviet Academy of Sciences and by scientists on the ground, unless you take them seriously. And I have this all laid out in my book, Manual for Survival. The count that I got just from Ukraine alone is that 35,000 people, 35,000 women today get compensation for having a husband who died from a Chernobyl-related illness. Now, that's just men who are married that are in that count. Off the record, in 2016, Ukrainian officials told me that they estimated about 150,000 Ukrainians had died by that time from Chernobyl illness. 150,000, wow. Not 54.
Right.
And that does not take into account Belarus and Russia, where we could find no data that they have collected and revealed on any level.
Absolutely.
And Belarus and Russia got 80% of Chernobyl radiation, not Ukraine.
That's mind-boggling, and thank you for sharing that. I'm going to switch now, just conscious of time, to our next guest, and thank you for sharing that with us. Paul, we know that we need to take drastic action to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels. We know that the UN's IPCC report concludes that if we don't, we face potentially irreversible consequences from the negative impacts of climate change in the form of extreme weather, uninhabitable land, rising sea levels, things of that nature. How should we reconcile climate change and nuclear energy? We discussed this a little bit before, with some of the other guests, but tell us about how we reconcile those two things.
Okay, so the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, states that right now renewables are 10 times more efficient at CO2 mitigation, at working on climate change than nuclear. That's the IPCC. The US Army War College says that nuclear is at high risk of temporary or permanent closure due to climate threats, with US civil and military nuclear vulnerable to sea level rise, severe storms, and cooling water issues. And the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission says that 55 US nuclear sites have already experienced flooding hazard beyond their design base. So basically, what we're saying is that nuclear is on the front line of climate change, and not in a good way. That basically one of the key issues around is climate impact on nuclear. Now, we hope that sea level rise will be step change. We don't know, but we hope that it will be step change. What is very clear is storm surge. And that happens when certain atmospheric conditions meet high tides. Basically, the sea basically ups and moves inland. Now, the problem with that is that the vast majority of current nuclear sites were built before climate became an issue. And even the newer sites have, there are very profound questions as to whether they are proof against climate impact. And the more that we know about climate, the more we realize that it's going to come quicker and harder than we had imagined. So I don't want to catastrophize about all of this, but it's something that really needs to be taken very, very seriously, because, as discussed, the IPCC says that renewables are 10 times better than nuclear at CO2 mitigation. So the question is, why on earth would we want to go for this profoundly risky option when there are better, safer, faster, more practical options? And the key to this is time also. Now, according to the UK government, looking at the global figures, one nuclear station takes up to about 17 years to put down. That includes sort of planning and application, safety regulation, and then about a 10-year construction period. And when one looks at all of the construction that's been going on, all of the new nuclear constructions are hugely overcost and hugely overtime. So basically, they take a very, very long time to build. Now, we really do not have that time. We just don't have time for new nuclear. That's 17 years, well, call it 10 years if you want to be hugely optimistic, or 15 years to be hugely optimistic for one nuclear power plant. Okay, and we know the climate is chasing us. Now, compare that with renewables. Now, 86% of all new electricity generation capacity worldwide last year was renewables, with nuclear nowhere. So there's this sort of very odd thing, is that what we're seeing at the moment is this sort of very significant policy, press, media, nuclear push, which really, if one looks at the detail, if you look at what really is going on, just absolutely doesn't make sense.
It really doesn't. And let's talk for a second about if I were on the other side of this argument, which I'm not, I might say, what about small nuclear reactors, SMRs, small modular reactors? They're very expensive to build, and as you were saying, they take a long time to build. Can you tell us about the wisdom of investing money in constructing SMRs vis-a-vis what they cost, how long they take to construct, and what they ultimately offer us in terms of energy power?
Okay, the problem with SMRs, I mean, a key problem with SMRs is that they don't exist. There's no functioning commercial SMR functioning at the moment. It simply doesn't exist. So you're talking about significant developmental times. In other words, a long time to commercialization, which could be what? Late 2030s before we see even one in commercial use, which again is too late for our climate problems. We now know people, all of the colleagues that we've spoken to today have been looking at climate for 30, 40 years or so. We've all been singing the same tune for the last 30 years. We simply don't have time. Now, the key about SMRs is that they say that they'll do better. This is the new kid on the block.
Right.
The problem is that the whole history of nuclear has been what's known as economies of scale. In other words, bigger is better in terms of to get the economies of scale, it makes it more economic. You're seeing that in terms of wind as well too. The larger the wind power, the greater the output. Now, what SMRs say is that they're going to do without these economies of scale, which the whole of nuclear history has been built upon, and replace it by the economies of modularization. In other words, the factory run. Now, there are a series of problems with that. The first is, in order to get a factory run, you've got to put in place a huge supply chain in order then to go for your factory run. And the economic risk for that is enormous, is huge, greater, in fact, than large new nuclear. The other problem with factory runs is that if you have a problem, that problem is replicated along that factory run. The other problem is that in order to get that supply chain, in order to get that factory run, you've got to get a huge amount of order book. You've got to get a lot of people wanting to buy your product. So you've got a chicken and egg situation. Then you have the problem of proliferation. Where are these smaller reactors going to go? Well, to places that may not have sufficient nuclear regulation, may not have an ability to do the so-called proper security and safety rules associated with that. And then you have the kinds of fuel that some of these advanced reactors need, which are very significant proliferation problems. But the key to all of this, really, most importantly in nuclear, is that the motivation behind SMRs appears to be a sort of financial risk management. So rather than running the risk of losing a big chunk of money on a single large nuclear reactor, they offer investors the opportunity to lose even more money on a well-diversified portfolio of products. Now, in this sense, and this is a very important point to make,
right,
in recent years, the nuclear industry has quietly changed its SMR business model from making and selling products to harvesting subsidies for SMR fantasies. Now, we've seen this, and where the underlying problem sort of surfaces. NuScale, gone. NuScale was the most important SMR in the US. And that was going to sort of change all our minds about SMRs. Just this week, EDF, Electricité de France, gone in terms of SMRs. So we're seeing
and when you say gone, can you explain?
Okay, so the NuScale was supposed to be the most important SMR that in the US. Okay, and last year, there's a very significant cost associated with NuScale development, NuScale SMRs, meant that NuScale had to say, I'm sorry, but we're pulling out on our design. It just simply doesn't make financial sense. Nobody's going to buy it.
And I should note for the audience that you are based in France.
I'm based in France, yeah. And then in France, just this week, EDF, Electricité de France, And we know about France and nuclear. It's sort of nuclear par excellence. It's where nuclear is, more nuclear plants per person happen in France. EDF have just sort of pulled the plug on their SMR design, saying that they're going to have to recreate once more a nuclear SMR design. In other words, sort of pushing it down the line.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's so important to have a European perspective here on this broadcast, just for us to have a full planetary perspective. And what you're saying is as alarming as what everyone else is telling us. And this is I'm hoping that people watching are taking away the lessons imparted by all of you. And I now want to bring in our last guest, and I want to thank her for being so patient and for coming in. Finally, Susan Hito Shapiro. Susan, your work as an environmental lawyer in New York's Hudson Valley has given you unique insights into the workings of an energy giant, Holtec. Holtec is really the villain of so many of these stories around the country. These insights should make everyone in the country pay attention. Tell us more about Holtec and why we should be very concerned with their business model and their track record.
Well, Holtec is what we would call a very, very bad corporate citizen. It's a private company that's owned by one man named Krishna Singh, and they have a long history and a long laundry list of malfeasance. Recently, George Norcross, who's a political operative in New Jersey, and a board member of Holtec and a partner of Singh, was indicted for racketeering, extortion, criminal conspiracy. Holtec has already agreed to pay $5 million in penalties, but I believe that it's going to probably go higher. They're losing all their tax breaks. The Tennessee Valley Authority has fined Holtec $2 million for bribery. In New Mexico, we heard from Leona, Holtec, and Texas, Holtec has been pushing this interim storage, which is insane on so many levels besides what the problems are in New Mexico, the concept of transporting nuclear waste across the nation, which we haven't even talked about, in casks that Holtec is using in the United States, which are not transport casks. And what Holtec is doing, I love the term that was just used, the harvesting of subsidies. Holtec is harvesting decommissioning funds. What they're doing is they're taking over reactor sites that are shuttered, and they're claiming that they're going to do a really, really fast cleanup and decommissioning, and then they're going to take the leftover decommissioning funds. And in the meantime, they're going in and they're taking the funds and they're misusing the funds. There's been reports by the GAO recently at Indian Point, Oyster Creek, and Palisades, and in Pilgrim, where they're taking the funds and they're using it for promoting and various things, millions and millions of dollars.
Susan, let me back up for a second, just to give context to the audience. When a Holtec comes in, explain how this works to the audience. When a plant such as Indian Point is decommissioned, with 36 miles north of New York City on the Hudson River, Holtec has come in and taken over, and I think, if I understand, they're able to buy it for really on the cheap, like for very, very little, and then there's a certain amount of funds that are reserved for that work. They do it as cheaply as possible, and then they take the rest of the money. So can you explain how that works more articulately than I just did?
So during the lifetime of a reactor, there's been monies that's been taken out of the ratepayers' rate that's been put aside for decommissioning. So it's actually ratepayers' money that's being held by the state usually for decommissioning, to clean the site, to make sure that it can go back to being a clean site. But the reality is all these sites are going to be long-term permanent storage sites. Every reactor in this nation has now become a dump, a nuclear dump. But Holtec goes in and makes promises to the local community saying, we're going to do it fast. And they make a deal with the state government nobody wants responsibility. And they say, well, it's a monopoly as well, because Holtec is building the dry casts in this country and got approval from the NRC to build the dry casts. So they're getting paid for building the dry casts, which they then put on these reactor sites, which are substandard. They're already leaking before, and they're scratched, and there are problems, as San Onofre well knows, and all over the country. And there are problems with them even before they start. But their goal is to as quickly as possible, dump the radiation in the tritium, for example. They're trying to dump it into the Hudson River, into Cape Cod Bay as quickly as possible so that they can say the site's clean. Reality is none of these sites are going to be decommissioned as long as radioactive waste is there. So the whole thing is a red herring. It's a false premise. But Holtec is a really horrible player. To be employed by Holtec, they're making their employees sign employment agreements where that they'll be penalized if they become whistleblowers, if they notify anyone of problems. That's illegal. They're doing that. They've been caught doing that. For example, in Indian Point, a law has been passed by New York State that they can't dump tritium into the Hudson. This week, the AG just sued Holtec for dumping tritium into the Hudson this past year. So, and at Pilgrim, the EPA has told them they can't dump into the Cape Cod Bay. So they're evaporating the tritium with heaters. They've brought in heaters into the buildings and they're evaporating it. So they're putting the tritium into the air. Because remember, tritium is water. Water vapor is a radioactive waste. It's a radioactive greenhouse gas when it's heated and put into the atmosphere. Holtec is truly a mercenary, just interested in getting as much money out as possible. We know at Indian Point, they've already overspent what they claimed was their budget in a very short period of time. All the reactor sites are going to run out of decommissioning funds, and the states are going to be left holding the bag. I predict that Holtec will soon go bankrupt at some point, and this whole scheme is going to blow up in the face of all the states where reactors have been sited, because there is no long-term plan for radioactive waste.
At the very least, we should be concerned that in addition to the corruption is an evil icing on the cake, but at the very least, we should be concerned that Holtec is the party responsible for safely decommissioning these plants, let alone like the horrible business practices they have.
Exactly. And they're doing it as cheap as possible. And then you have the other side of it is that now Holtec has become the owner of radioactive waste. That was never supposed to happen. The DOE was supposed to take ownership and title to the waste. That was the promise they made to the states, but they didn't. And now the Holtec is the one who's owning it. So now we have privatized nuclear waste in this country, and Holtec is holding it. And we already know Holtec is a corrupt company. So that should be a big concern to everyone. Like, what's going to happen with all this radioactive waste that's now stored at every reactor site around the nation?
Susan, as we've discussed with some of the other guests already, there's a vocal movement in climate circles about how nuclear energy is necessary for us to achieve a transition away from fossil fuels and to cleaner energy sources. We've talked with a number of guests already who noted that nuclear energy is not clean. But you take issue with even the fact that that nuclear energy is necessary to achieve a transition away from fossil fuels because of the process. Not alone, we've been talking about the waste, but the process itself, the nuclear energy process itself, is dirty. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, so nuclear energy is the dirtiest, deadliest, most dangerous, and hottest human activity. It's hot. It's truly hot. We forget about thermal pollution. Thermal pollution is a real climate change problem. Thermal pollution created by nuclear has been going on since the first day of fission. So unlike greenhouse gases, unlike fossil fuels, I should say, nuclear energy, fossil fuels will burn once. It will create CO2 that does create a greenhouse gas effect. I'm not denying that's a problem. But then it's cold. It doesn't burn. It doesn't keep giving off heat. Whereas nuclear, once fission starts, it keeps burning and giving off waste heat until all its half-lives are used up. It could be hundreds or thousands of years that's generating heat. So we have to multiply time over and plus heat for nuclear, which we never consider. And we don't consider that nuclear not only has a conventional carbon footprint, which they claim that nuclear is carbon-free. That's a false claim. It's just a straight-up false claim. Nuclear is also the only thing on the planet that creates new carbon atoms. That in the nuclear fission process, it creates carbon-14 atoms, which are also released as radioactive CO2. That is a a known climate change accelerator. It also releases a whole other slew of radioactive chemicals that into the air that are known climate change accelerators, but that is never considered. The reality is there's been a fortune of money spent by the nuclear industry to greenwash nuclear. And unfortunately, a lot of good meaning climate change activists, anti-fossil fuel activists, are now promoting nuclear. They've become nuclear cheerleaders, and it's extremely dangerous. And I really, we've been talking about how we need to talk about this and get people to understand this. This is really important that people understand that nuclear is a major climate change contributor. It is in no way any part of a climate change solution. It also, as has been said before, it takes enormous amount of subsidies. It has always been the most subsidized industry in this nation. It's continuing to take subsidies that should be going to renewable energy, to the true renewables. And instead, in states like Illinois and New York and other states, that they have dug themselves into the portfolio for clean energy, and they're taking the majority of the money. I know, for example, in New York, ratepayers are paying $7.6 billion to keep upstate nukes open. And that money is supposed to go to renewables, whereas renewables in that whole program are getting $1 billion. The playing field is so unequal that nuclear is preventing us from having a clean energy future.
Wow.
That's one of the largest problems. And so, this concept that we need to transition through nuclear is just so wrong-headed. We're not going to have a clean climate solution unless we get away from nuclear and somehow we communicate to people that nuclear is really a climate change causer, a contributor.
As opposed to an alternative. Thank you, Susan, for sharing that. Paul Shockley, our producer, I know that we're 12 minutes over. Do we have time for another question? Is that okay? Okay. This is for the group. We're going back to just the second group for a second. And I'm going to, this is a European question, but with implications for the rest of us. Germany is one of the most successful economies in the world, and their parliament voted to phase out nuclear power by last year, which they have done. What lessons can we learn from Germany? And is the country happy with this decision, or have there been negative consequences from the transition? I'm going to ask Paul to weigh in just because he's in Europe, and then I'm also going to ask Kate to weigh in just because she has a global perspective on that, if that's okay. And if you will, if you can make the answers rather short, and I apologize for that, but we're just over time. Okay. Paul, go ahead.
Okay, Germany, the strongest economy in Europe, has gone nuclear free for perhaps obvious reasons. There was the fear that nuclear would be replaced by fossil fuel. In fact, what actually has happened is that basically nuclear has done that, and at the same time, fossil fuels has also done that. So nuclear is absolutely not being replaced by fossil fuel in Germany. There's no question about that. Renewables have basically ramped in Germany. So anything that was lost from nuclear has been replaced, more than replaced, by renewables. Of course, Germany has been affected by Russian invasion of Ukraine, and all that implies in terms of the economy and the question of gas, which has affected everybody. And so there's a relative sort of slowdown, economic slowdown in Germany, but that has nothing to do with going nuclear free. In fact, nuclear at time of cutoff was completely marginal to the German economy.
Thank you, Paul. How about Kate? Anything to add there?
Well, I'll just add that the motivation for this was that after Fukushima in 2011, they judged up an old Chernobyl documentary, and that convinced Angela Merkel, who has a degree in physics, that convinced the country that it's time to stop taking these kinds of risks in small countries, densely populated, a lot like the state of California.
Thank you. And I want to make sure that Leona and Susan get one more chance to respond. Leona, you can answer that question, or is there anything else you'd like to address as well?
Well, sure. I mean, when we talk about Germany's phase out, we can't neglect that they have other nuclear facilities. and they're also holding US weapons. And so there's a lot of work still to be done in Germany. I mean, what are they going to do with their waste? So Gorleben, just like CIS in the United States, is problematic. I mean, these facilities, are they really safe? Yeah, so just across the board, I think when we're talking about waste, we've talked about high level radioactive waste and some other areas, but going all the way from the front end, the uranium exploration, the development, the milling, I just want to point out that when we're talking about milling, there's only one uranium mill in the country. And this is not taking a lot of new uranium. Lately, they've been processing what's called alternate feed. So the mill has been used as an ad hoc nuclear waste dump because Japan, they just sent a shipment to the mill in Utah because these other countries don't have waste facilities. And so, what happens when they start building waste facilities in the United States, especially on indigenous people's lands, and we have these international companies that are trying to bring in waste from the outside? I know that that hasn't happened on a larger scale, but it is happening at the White Mesa Mill. And so we need to just stop all nuclear developments. We need to demand funding for new types of waste. So this means the creation of waste at all levels, from the beginning of the fuel chain, all of the processing and the fuel fabrication, to the power plant, and then what happens after the power plant, as well as weapons, because nuclear weapons, access to nuclear is not an inalienable right. And so just the last thing I want to say is that we have to consider also our energy consumption as humans. It doesn't make any sense to just transition to some other form of energy. When we're talking about nuclear and uranium, that impacts our people. But lithium, cobalt, other types of extraction, that hurts people somewhere else. And so when we're talking about energy, we really need to reduce our consumption and overall just stop all nuclear. We don't have anywhere to put the waste, and we need to fund studies, cleanup, clean water, especially in the desert during climate change. We're facing a lot of changes in what's going on in our environment, and nuclear is actually depleting our water resources and like Susan said, making climate change worse. So lastly, I'll just say we all have to demand that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change
That's the
also
IPCC that we referred to earlier.
right, that it calculate the true carbon footprint of nuclear. Again, going from the beginning of the uranium extraction all the way to the storage, which is forever storage. I mean, all that concrete, all of the stuff that we need to store it. And water is a natural barrier for radiation. We cannot be using water and contaminating it for future generations. We need to stop contaminating water and protect it for our future generations.
Thank you for that perspective, Leona. It's so important. And I would love to mention a project that we're working on with another group called Pixera Global, which is an urban mining initiative. Which is, there's enough critical raw minerals in the phones, tablets, and laptops that we're going to dispose that we can collect in cities and create new SMEs for structurally disadvantaged and minority communities to create these new businesses, rather than extracting those critical raw minerals from other places such as the Congo and places like that. But thank you for that perspective, Leona. And Susan, you're going to get the last word. Do you want to address the Germany question or anything else?
I think I don't know that much detail about Germany, but I'm thankful that they have phased out nuclear. I think that's what the rest of the world needs to do. We don't have a solution for nuclear waste. There is no solution to nuclear waste, and every day that we make more of it, we're just making more waste that we don't that we're leaving to future generations to deal with, and we're endangering, populations and the health concerns, which we haven't really touched upon this only a little bit. But I'm on the board of Radiation Public Health Project, and we have done studies around nuclear reactors, and we can absolutely see, for example, thyroid cancer rates around nuclear reactors are extraordinarily high. That is a marker. We can absolutely see it. Of course, there are no health studies that have been done in the United States on nuclear at all. In fact, any study has been canceled. And that's a really important thing, but that is, we all know it's dangerous. Nobody would stand near a nuclear reactor or near nuclear products, but there are no health studies. And so they, like in Chernobyl, every government, this government as well, is hiding behind the real impact of nuclear. And the water issues and all the aspects of nuclear is one of the things where it's a bad science experiment, where it's, we're 60, 70, 80 years into this bad science experiment, and we're the guinea pigs, the human race, our generation, our next generations, and it bioaccumulates, and it's a generational thing, and women are much more impacted by nuclear health issues. And has historically been, women's health issues are less considered. So once again, I think this is not only a human issue and as Leona said, our non-human friends, our non-human relatives issue, but it's really an issue of reproductive future for the human race. So whatever we can do to stop the continuation of nuclear is, I think, where we need to go.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for this fascinating conversation, for sharing your perspectives here today. You're all doing such phenomenal work with consequences that seem bound to have more impact on our future than ever before. So I appreciate all of you being here. That concludes our program today. To rewatch this podcast or to see a transcript, go to the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website in the coming days. The website is samuellawrencefoundation.org. Thank you so much to Energy Intelligence, the University of Hawaii at Manoa, MIT, the Nuclear Issues Study Group, Hall No, the Radiation and Public Health Project, San Clemente Green, San Diego State, and the University of Sussex for their participation in today's event. And thank you to Blue Planet Alliance for their partnership in First Fridays. To learn more about the critical work all participating parties are doing to advance sustainable initiatives and to stay informed about upcoming events and important initiatives, sign up for the Samuel Lawrence Foundation newsletter. Please also visit brooklynstorylab.net to learn more about the purpose-driven work that we are doing globally. Also, as noted at the top of the program, on July 24th, the Samuel Lawrence Foundation will be hosting an in-person symposium in San Diego on the problem of deadly radioactive nuclear waste. That event will be hosted on the campus of the University of California in San Diego. Please visit the Samuel Lawrence Foundation website for more details about how to register to attend this free and critically important symposium featuring many of the panelists who joined us here today. Thank you so much, and goodbye.